Welcome, everyone, to the Returners Hideout Fun of Fantasy podcast. I'm your host, Leonard Phillips, and today we're going to talk about the 35th anniversary of the Fun of Fantasy series, which is coming up in a few months. I just wanted to point out really quickly that this is the very first podcast episode, and I don't know, I'm a little nerve-wracked, but I figure we're just going to get into it, and I'm just going to jump in and get this thing started. So today we're mainly going to cover the release of the very first Fun of Fantasy game. We're going to talk about that for a second, and we're going to jump directly in from that point to where it's at now, just sort of the major success that it's become, and then we're going to pivot from there, and I'm going to jump straight into my own story with the Fun of Fantasy series and how it ultimately led to the podcast that you're listening to currently and the YouTube channel that I sort of started, all because of a series that was released 35 years ago. And if you're listening to this on Spotify or wherever else you listen to podcasts at, there's sort of a sister YouTube channel to this podcast, and it's youtube.com/The Returners Hideout. And basically, you know, I do a lot of in-depth analysis of things, sometimes unsuccessfully, but and also what I like to call conspiracy theories. I sort of go into, I don't know, I tend to overplay these games and find things that I think at the time people aren't finding, but then I later on realize that I'm just diving in a bit too deep. But if you want to check that out, again, that's youtube.com/The Returners Hideout. And so before we get into talking about Final Fantasy 1 and its release, I did want to take a second and just thank Buzzsprout for hosting this podcast. And this isn't a plug for Buzzsprout or anything. I'm not sponsored by anybody. Again, this is episode 1. However, they do offer a lot of things that I didn't expect to be offered. And all the places that they allow your podcast to go on to, it's sort of insane. So I wanted to give them a real quick thank you for hosting this podcast. All right, it is time for episode 1 to begin, where we talk about the 35th anniversary of the Fun of Fantasy series. Now, the very first Fun of Fantasy game was released on December 18th of 1987 in Japan. I wanted to really sort of focus on the Japan release versus the American release, which wasn't until 1990. And immediately I've seen a lot of videos and articles talking about the naming of the series, Final Fantasy, and there's this rumor floating around that Hironobu Sakaguchi, who's the creator of the Final Fantasy series, was going back to... He figured one more game he's going to try one more time. This is the myth. None of the games were successful leading up to Final Fantasy. And so he's going to give it one more try, and this is the Final Fantasy. And if it doesn't work out, he's going to go back to college and refigure things out. And the other sort of rumor associated with this is the rumor that Squaresoft, which is what they were called at the time, or just Square, was facing financial issues going into almost bankruptcy, and this was the last hurrah of Square before they called it quits. And then it turned out to be this massive thing. And I do want to point out that I think, me personally, I think that there is some truth to those sort of rumors and myths, especially because Sakaguchi himself sort of said that he was going to go back to college and all this stuff, and sort of started the whole rumor. And then Nobuo Uematsu, who composed most of the entire series, actually sort of fed into it, and he was the one that said the Square going into bankruptcy thing. In recent years, however, Sakaguchi's definitely downplayed the importance of the whole rumor of, you know, them facing financial issues. And actually, I stopped and thought about it for a second, and I didn't look up the numbers ahead of time, and maybe I should have. But Square had Rad Racer out, you know, around that time. You know, they had their games that did all right. So I don't necessarily think that bankruptcy was a thing, because they had 20 or so employees at the time whenever Sakaguchi joined. So I don't necessarily know that they were looking at bankruptcy. And as I said, Sakaguchi definitely has downplayed in recent years the myth, and basically these days he's said that it's not so much important, that part of it is why it got named Final Fantasy. He said that he was just simply looking for another word that started with an F. Any word would do. And in fact, it was originally going to be called Fighting Fantasy for a long time. And Sakaguchi said that he wanted alliteration to where in English it would just be 2 letters. And Final Fantasy ended up fitting that that sort of bill. However, due to the way the internet works and due to the way that the Whisper game works, and it just, the myth, and I don't even want to call it a myth because I think there is some truth to it, but the myth definitely took a life of its own, and it's considered, you know, absolutely canon that that's the exact story and that's the way it went. When, I mean, maybe so, but I don't think that it was necessarily that severe. I do think that at the time, and this is based off of something that Sakaguchi said also, that the games industry at the time was definitely backs against the wall. Like it was pretty intense, but I don't know. Now that he's downplayed it in recent interviews, I don't know how severe this whole thing was. And so with that, we're going to go a little bit into what happened right before the first Final Fantasy game was released. Because several things happened in order for it to be as big of a success that it is now. While the very first Final Fantasy was being developed, Sakaguchi took it to a magazine that was called Family Computer Magazine. He took a not-so-finished ROM of it to the magazine in order to cover it, just to gain it some publicity and give it a really good chance at doing well initially. And Family Computer Magazine flat out said, no, we're not going to cover it. We don't have faith in this product. And so he then took it to a magazine called Famitsu, which, if you know anything about Famitsu, it's a magazine that's ultra strict on their video game reviewing scores. And Sakaguchi has since gone on to say that that was the only magazine that gave Final Fantasy any sort of chance in the beginning. As far as coverage and publicity on it in order to sell a certain number of copies, which leads us into our next point. Basically, Sakaguchi went up to management of Square and asked how many copies of this were going to be shipped out. And Square initially said 200,000 copies and that's it. You know, it's kind of a limited, small release, and Sakaguchi said no, there's no way. It's in order for this to be successful and in order for this to have a sequel, it needs to have legitimately double that amount. And Square initially said no to that also. However, they did work out a deal, and it ended up selling, I think, over 500,000 copies. And so I think the Famitsu magazine really going out of their way to give Final Fantasy a shot, and then Square management agreeing to have 400,000 copies shipped, or manufactured and shipped. I think it really lended to how well the game did, especially in Japan. It did really well. And it did all right here in the States. But also, in a fairly recent interview, Sakaguchi stated that the working conditions in Square, which I think is true across the board of most game development studios at the time, it wasn't great. And when Sakaguchi came on board, he made note that there were 20 employees, and he said, oh my gosh, like this, I don't know how we're going to do, you know, Final Fantasy, you know, splitting off in teams to have one do the Final Fantasy series and one do the other games for Square. And he made note of that by saying, you know, I don't know how we're going to do this. However, the employees of Square, the other 20 employees of Square, took that as him saying, with this team, it's impossible. And there was a lot of tension in the studio because of those things. And so you think about Square as a development company way back in '87, putting out this game that they didn't even know, you know, would do well, but Sakaguchi definitely had this vision of it doing well. And then fast forward to now. In 2022, you know, you've got Final Fantasy 16 coming out next year. Earlier this year, you had the Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origins game that came out. That just, you know, if you do searches on YouTube about it, you'll find plenty of information about how good it is and how it ties into the very first Final Fantasy game. And then you had the Final Fantasy Pixel Remasters release, mostly in 2021, a little bit into 2022, and those have taken off really well. Sort of giving newer fans an opportunity to play the first 6 games, which I really feel that the first 6 games are just a golden age of Square and the games that they were making. Even when you look outside of the Final Fantasy series, and they made, you know, Secret of Mana, and games we didn't even get over here, Bahamut Lagoon, you know, all those games, massive games that broke a lot of boundaries and bend the rules a little bit and really showcased the power of the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo before it. And actually, I can't even mention Final Fantasy and where it's at now without talking about Final Fantasy 14, which is just massive, that game is. Just in this past month alone, MMOpopulation.com actually estimated that there are 2.29 million active users that log on daily. Over 2 million active users, and it has, according to them, over 40 million total players. That is a massive number of anything. I can't even think of anything where 40 million is a small... Rice? No, that's still a lot of rice. But anyway, you get my point. It's a massive amount of people that play the game, and not, well, 2.29 million that log on daily. Still, that's a massive amount of people that log on daily to this game that they love. According to a Square press release as of April of this year, April of 2022, they've sold 168 million units, which makes them one of the top selling franchises of video game history. And it all started from Hironobu Sakaguchi saying, can you please give this game a chance? I think it'll do great. To now, this massive, massive thing. You know, I think it's incredible. And that's not even remotely the entire story. It had many ups and downs, but I do want to pivot real quick and talk about my own story with the series and how I got into it and how it led to ultimately creating this podcast and this YouTube channel that I run. And the story actually starts a really long time ago in the summer of 1992. I have a cousin of mine who I visited regularly around this time. I would spend the night at his house just about every weekend, and there was this one particular weekend that I came over there, and he was playing this game I had never seen. Now, for context, my cousin and I, we would call each other from our respective houses and talk for hours while we were playing two different games. He would be playing, let's say, a Mega Man title, and I would be playing like Super Mario World. And we would just talk about what was going on. So that was sort of the connection that he and I had just through video gaming, and I don't know how at the time mystical it was and brand new it felt to a bunch of kids. You know, we were two kids. I think we were maybe 6 years old or so. Anyway, I went over to his house, and he was playing this really, really weird looking... There's a lot of words on screen and numbers flying around. There were swords. And I asked him what it was called, and he said, well, this is Final Fantasy II, which is, as we know now, is Final Fantasy IV. And I was like, well, what is happening on screen? It was in a battle. Retrospect is a funny thing. He was in battle, and I couldn't understand what was happening on screen. I was, at the time, used to Mario Brothers, Mega Man, Sonic the Hedgehog, those kind of games, whereas a 2D side-scroller platforming... You know, now you've got these 5 people on one side, and you've got some gross-looking enemies over here, and they're sort of clashing, right? I did not understand. And he said, oh, do you want to play it? You know, and I picked up the controller, and no clue what I was doing. Not a clue. I was attacking party members. I didn't understand the menu system. And then he explained it to me. And once he explained it a little bit, and for the life of me, I can't remember how he explained it, but it was enough for my 6-year-old brain to go, oh, I got it. Okay, now I see what's happening. And immediately, I fell in love with this thing. I think I only saw maybe 30 minutes to an hour of it, and I was enthralled. It was like, the music is cool. The sound effects are really neat. I love the idea of battling like this in sort of a, I don't know, medieval-styled swords and dragons and magic, and it's super cool. I love it all. And then anyway, some time had passed, and we sort of moved on to other games, but I went up to him, and I was like, can I borrow this game for a long time? I think he let me end up borrowing it for like a year or something. Just a crazy long time. And in that time, I played it endlessly. I couldn't tell you how many hours I logged onto it. And I just fell in love with it. And then not long after that, Final Fantasy III for Super Nintendo came out, which is Final Fantasy VI now. And I remember he called me and he said, I got it. I got Final Fantasy III. And he was telling me how much better it looked, how much better it sounded. And I was like, how can you get any better than this? Which is Final Fantasy II. So I went over there, I don't know, a week or two later, and I saw how absolutely gorgeous the game looked. And he and his mom were at the end of it, and they were struggling with it, and they said, you know, here, take the controller, see if you can beat it, we'll tell you what to do. And me being still kind of new to the series, not really fully understanding everything, because it was a brand new Final Fantasy game, I didn't know what was happening, what spells do what. And so they were guiding me through this thing. And then finally, the final boss went down, and we watched the credit sequence. Credit sequence, I'm going to bring this up later on in a very funny story. Not specifically to Final Fantasy 3 or 6, but we'll get there. For my 10th birthday, in October of 1995, my parents gave me $100 and said, you can buy anything you want. So we went to this pawn shop, and at first I bought Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, which was $50. And we went there, and I bought Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, which I was a huge Mortal Kombat fan at the time. The first two I adored, specifically 2. I put Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 into my Super Nintendo, and what came on screen but a football game? My 10-year-old mind could not wrap my head around the idea that somebody opened it up and switched boards around. But I got this sort of, I don't know, super messed up copy of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. I can't even tell you what football game it was, which I'm not a fan of. I know that the sports game genre is huge right now. All the FIFA games are gigantic. But at the time, I bought Mortal Kombat 3 because I wanted to play Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. I didn't want to play a football game. And my dad took it back to the pawn shop and he said, we give no refunds. I don't know what happened, but ultimately, Dad did get a refund. I'm not going to question how. Thanks, Dad. Because I went back to the same pawn shop later on that day, and I walked up to the counter, and behind him was an in-box copy of Final Fantasy 3, and it was $50. So I gladly forked over the $50 for the in-box copy of Final Fantasy 3. I'm surprised that that cartridge still works in any capacity. I'm afraid to know how many hours I've put into that Super Nintendo cart. That is the Final Fantasy game that really got me into not only RPGs and gaming as a whole, but it also got me into a lot of musical aspects and what game music could do to your emotions as you play through a lot of these titles. I remember learning how to harmonize on my own from these songs that played during this game. And I remember it having such a big impact on me as such a young fella. And I didn't want it to end. I never wanted it to end. And at the time, no other game was this big to me. You know, no other game would I spend 50 hours playing through it. One playthrough. You know, Mario World, you give me an afternoon, I'll have it done. This was like, you had to dedicate a week, at least, to even get anywhere close to being done with it. And it was a very, and I don't know, it was because I was just 10 or because I was fairly impressionable at the time. I can't tell you how super in love with this game I was. Every aspect of it, the music played in perfectly to how it looked, to how it played. All the characters are super cool. I just adored it from beginning to end. I didn't want it to end, and I didn't beat it for a long time because I didn't want it to end. But of course, finally you do sort of go through it and you get it done, and then you watch the credit sequence and it's really long. And I went back through immediately and started a new game and played it again. And I did that over and over and over. And actually on my wall, just to my left here, I have a framed copy of Final Fantasy 2 and 3 for Super Nintendo. And I'm going to do a video on this on the channel fairly soon. It's been asked of me in my comment section to do this type of video. So I am going to finally break down and do it sometime, fairly soon. But I have a framed copy of those two. Not because I simply own those copies and they just went up on the wall. Those actually are the two exact copies that my cousin owned that I first played. And to sort of give evidence to that, there's a dust cover. I'm looking at it right now. There's a dust cover on Final Fantasy 2 that I had drawn on with a Sharpie when I was maybe 11 or 12. And it's still on it. And so not only are those the two games that I started with, those are the exact two copies I first played ever in my life of any Final Fantasy game. Those are them. As I said, my cousin was the first one that introduced me to it. Those are his two copies that I ended up buying a lot of his game collection. I couldn't even tell you now. I've got so many of them. But I specifically wanted those two for that reason, is that not only were those the games that I played, but the exact copies of those games that started this whole thing that I'm doing now. This love of the series never stopped. Fast forward to about 2001, I just turned 16. I've made reference to my first job in a couple of videos, but I was working at a Burger King where my mom was the manager of the whole thing. And she's the one that got me the job, blah, blah, blah. So I had this extra money floating around. Not a lot, but a fella I went to school with was selling a copy of Final Fantasy X for a PS2, and I bought it. Here's the problem. I didn't have a PS2 yet. So I've read through the manual probably 40 times. I think I bought the strategy guide along with it, or borrowed it and just never returned it. I've still got it over there in a stack of strategy guides somewhere. But I mean, that's how crazy about the series I was. I bought a copy of Final Fantasy X. I'm talking months before, because my birthday's in October, and I got a job not long after that. I didn't get a PS2 till I think that next December, 2 months later. So I had, around 2 months of holding this copy of Final Fantasy X, reading the manual, reading the back, looking at the photos, going, what is this game? I just want to play it. That's all I want to do. And finally, 2 months later, it happened. And that credit sequence of that game, I brought up credit sequences earlier. I had a really, really funny story about credit sequence in Final Fantasy X. So I was in high school, and I had a girlfriend at the time. And I remember specifically, very early, I woke up very early to play Final Fantasy X before school, because I was at the final boss. I was at Sin. It was a long and lengthy battle, and I finally did the last attack or whatever it was, and Sin started dying, and I was like, oh crap, I have to go to school. I have to go now. So I hit the pause button, and I thought, well, after school, I'll come back and watch the credit sequence, and, that'll be a super cool thing I do after school. During school hours, my girlfriend at the time comes up to me, and she says, do you want me to come over to your house after school? I have nothing to do. And I was like, yeah, sure, of course, that would be great. Not remembering that I had this game paused. So we get to my house, and I see my TV still on with the game paused. So I was like, oh yeah, by the way, real quick, I'm just going to watch this credit sequence. And I think, let me look this up real quick, because I really think that Final Fantasy X had one of the longer credit sequences. Just doing a real quick search, it looks like it's 15 minutes or so. And so for 15 minutes, this girl just sat. And I was just on the floor, sitting on the floor, just completely enthralled in this thing. So imagine that, if you will. We weren't dating for very long at that point. And here I am, sitting on the floor watching the end sequence of Final Fantasy X. Again, showing how absolutely crazy for the series I was and still am. And so I took that craziness for the series. And, you get older and you move out. And you get a little apartment and some terrible job. And then, you go through the phases of growing up, and you sort of lose... I don't want to say that I ever lost the love for it. I lost the time to play it. And I think your values change slightly when you hit, 21, 22. You tend to hang out with friends more. And I did all those things. And I would never change a thing about how I did anything growing up. But I always kept going back to the series, but I could never afford to buy the newest games coming out. I had just enough money to sort of pay my share of the bills, barely. So I would play the older games, and I think that's where I really developed my love of the earlier titles, and why even now, if you were to go to the Returner's Hideout YouTube channel, you would see I focus on the earlier titles. For that reason, for me, there's such a connection. I love the older games in the series, and that's not saying anything about any of the newer games. I love them equally as much. But I think for nostalgia's sake, and because that's what I spent most of my time doing, was playing the earlier titles. I don't know, I have this connection with them that I can't really explain, and I kind of like that I can't explain it. And in 2015, I started my very first YouTube channel ever, and it's still up, and I still use it for various things. I'll go into that in the future. And I knew immediately I wanted to do some sort of Final Fantasy something. I didn't know specifically what. I knew it was going to be called Final Fantasy Fridays. And I held on to that. Making videos and learning the YouTube process and failing miserably at getting any traction. Years passed, and in my mind the entire time, Final Fantasy Fridays, I need to do something. And then in 2021, this was about October of 2021, maybe November, I found a series of YouTube channels dedicated to helping people learn how to do YouTube and grow it properly. It was a very systemic approach. It was something achievable slowly over time. And so I really held on to these channels, and it made me go, okay, if I'm going to do something Final Fantasy related, I'm going to start a whole new channel, follow these YouTube help guides, and then in December of 2021, and I don't want to talk on this too much, my town that I live in got hit with a devastating tornado. It made national news and wiped out half the city. And we moved in with my fiance's grandparents. They live about 20 minutes outside of town. And we lived with them for about 2 months. And during that time, I studied these YouTube channels. There was no power in town. And nothing. It was totally blacked out and couldn't do anything. And so I spent that time really studying these YouTube help things. And then once I finally got home, the electric finally kicked back on, which I don't know how they did it so quickly, but they did. And I switched internet providers due to some crap that happened. And then I made the very first video for Returner's Hideout, which released on the very same day that the Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster came out, which is February 23rd. Fast forward to now, last time I checked, I have 370-something subs in 7 months. Like 20 or close to 20,000 total views. And a little small community of people that I talk to every upload. And now here I am recording and filming this podcast for the channel. And just in the same way that Sakaguchi went up to Square and said, please give this a shot. And Famitsu, please give this a shot. It's sort of the same thing that I did with this channel was I'm just going to start it. I'm going to put all that fear of starting YouTube behind me. And I'm just going to do it. And I'm sitting before you now with this microphone in my face, talking about a series that I'm absolutely crazy about. And like I said, I've got this small community now that I adore, and it keeps growing, and I really can't wait to see where all of this ends up. And I really think doing this podcast will do that even more so, because I can do things in sort of a candid way and sort of a long form. You know, I don't have to stop and edit and cut. I mean, I'm going to edit clearly, but yesterday I attempted to record this podcast 7 times, and I failed miserably every time. And so today I was like, I'm just going to do it. I just shut up and do the thing. And here we are at the end of it. And so real quick, anybody who took the time to listen to me ramble on about the Final Fantasy series and me growing up with it, I just want to say thank you for listening, watching if you're watching on the channel. And there is going to be a video on that channel very soon about my story with in-depth, and I'll bring the copies off the wall and I'll show the dust cover that has the Sharpie marker artwork that I did. It's nothing crazy. It's legitimately like FF2 written in this, what I thought at the time, my 11-year-old mind, was the same font. But anyway, I'll bring those off the wall and make a really long video about it. Again, thank you for watching. Thank you to Buzzsprout for hosting this thing. And I want everyone to remember one more thing. Never, ever, ever tease the octopus, kids.